Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here in such a timely manner after lunch. I appreciate it. I'm Yael Sternhell. I teach history and American studies here. And as a member of the organizing committee, I want to say that we made a decision pretty early on that we wanted most of the conference this year to be in Hebrew. Because we wanted to make this discussion, which feels so personal and raw, as accessible as possible. But we did want some outside perspective. And that's why we brought out here Professor Sarah Rubin, who is working on a book under the title, A Mouthful of Nothing, Food and Famine in the Civil War South. And food and famine have been very much on our minds over the last couple of years as we've seen our neighbors in Gaza starving under the brunt of Israel's war. And so I could not be more grateful and delighted to host Anne here to talk about her perspective on food and wartime here under these circumstances at this moment. So a few words about Anne. She's a professor of history at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Anne's first book is the award-winning, and if I may say so, field-changing, A Shattered Nation, The Rise and Fall of the Confederacy, 1861 to 1868. Her second book is Through the Heart of Dixie, Sherman's March and American Memory, which also came with a digital project. And I mentioned this because Anne is a real pioneer in digital humanities. She directed one of the first, maybe the first?
One of the first.
One of the first. Okay, let's not overstate it. Digital project back in the 1990s at the University of Virginia, the Valley of the Shadows, a study of two communities in the Civil War, one in Pennsylvania, one in Virginia. Still, I feel my personal favorite when it comes to digital history. But at the time, it was truly groundbreaking and has continued pursuing stayed on the cutting edge of digital humanities ever since. Her most recent book is an edited volume, The Perfect Scout, a soldier's memoir of the Great March to the Sea and the campaign of the Carolinas, and has been an OAH distinguished lecturer since 2011, and she was the president of the Southern Association for Women Historians in 2022 and president of the Society of Civil War Historians in 2012. So, let's get to it.
Okay.
There will be no PowerPoint. We got our assignment was a conversation, and we are, we are rule followers, and so we will indeed have this discussion in the form of a conversation. But I hope this will really leave plenty of room for questions and reflections from the audience about the questions that will come up in our discussion. Okay, so on the one hand, food seems like such an obvious concern for historians of any war. And yet, on the other hand, the book you are writing now will be the first treatment of this subject in a field that is one of the most crowded and overly researched, I would wager, across the historical discipline. So the question I want to start with is, how do you explain the neglect of this seemingly essential subject, and how are you approaching it?
So I don't see it as fully neglected. There are books about Civil War food. They tend to be sort of popular, like I have one that's I forget what it's called exactly, Civil War cooking or something, and it has glossy photographs and it has updated recipes for you to try. So there's a lot of that genre that is sort of like, oh, what did people eat and how could you try and make it today? And that kind of more popularization of the food question. There's less about hunger, which is what this book really has evolved to be a book about, because I think, of course, that's not like a fun, upbeat topic, to say the least.
And Americans like their wars to be as fun as possible.
They really like, I mean, it is actually a cultural fact that is true. And I think that what else has been written a lot, and where I first encountered looking at food and shortages and in the Confederacy was actually in these questions of food substitutions and how that becomes part of Confederate patriotism, which is to say that wealthy people who are used to eating things made of white flour and white sugar during the war find themselves having to eat things made of like cornmeal and molasses, sort of coarser food, more the food of the working class or the enslaved. And there's a genre of these recipes that come up for how to use these kind of unfamiliar ingredients, or, you know, how to make, like one that I always, you know, mock oysters, right? Which is basically like you just fry some cornmeal and it looks like an oyster, and so that's an oyster, right? Or an apple pie where the filling of the apple pie is not apples, but it's crackers, which actually is a recipe also that resurfaces in the 1930s in the United States during the Great Depression. So a lot of that kind of food substitutions and how people perceive themselves as being really patriotic for doing that. But then what I started to think about when I really started working on this book in earnest was, if the wealthy are eating the food of the poor, what are the poor eating? And how are the poor managing? And and also this realization, of course, that in a place as large as the Confederacy, which I look at it as 11 states, there's differences. And so people in urban areas actually are struggling much more than people in rural areas because they don't have their own gardens. They can't do any kind of foraging. And as I'm sure I don't have to tell all of you, famines are not natural occurring events. A famine is always to some degree man-made. And much of the shortages and hunger, while there's shortages and hunger in the Confederacy, a lot of that also has to do with there's rampant inflation in the Confederacy, and it all kind of works together. So,
which is really interesting because Fatina, in the previous panel, when she was sort of alluding to food insecurity, Dotan was trying to get her to speak about that in greater detail. She was saying, you know, there's always food. It's a question of access, right? And that's certainly the story of the Confederacy, which
Absolutely.
is a vast stretch of land, a very largely rich agricultural land, which could have easily fed a population of practically any size, right?
Yes.
And yet still, this is a war in which at least the sources tend to speak about famine in pretty considerable frequency. And the question, so were they, when a white planter says that she's suffering from hunger, that the Yankees have inflicted famine on the South, does she actually mean that she hasn't had her third cup of coffee today and is therefore deprived of her, God-given rights? Or is she actually describing a historical reality which we can identify as acute food insecurity?
Yeah, so if it is an elite woman, a wealthy planter woman writing in her diary, she really hasn't had her third cup of coffee because she hasn't even had her first cup of coffee, because coffee is actually something that the Confederacy runs out of really fast. And I can talk about the coffee substitutions for that, but suffice it to say, if they could make a brown liquid, they would call it coffee. And I have some ideas about that. So it's not at that elite strata, right? They're just having to dip into reserves. They're having to, eat food that, like, they don't have like a fancy cake if somebody gets married, right? But they still are not starving to death.
Starvation becomes a trope,
It's
right?
a trope, exactly.
It becomes a figure of speech.
Yes, I think so. Now there's another class, a kind of middle class strata, where they are definitely belt tightening. And maybe they are only eating sort of 2 meals a day. And then you have the poor white farm women. So for example, the title of my book, A Mouthful of Nothing, comes from the letters of this woman who is trying to keep her family farm together. She's writing to her husband. And at one point she says, I can't get no more than a mouthful of nothing to eat. She really is struggling. People are stealing her sweet potatoes and crops. And then the population that I'm also looking at that has really been left out of the narratives of food in the American South, although has been studied extensively by other historians, are African Americans, and most of whom were enslaved, and who find themselves in two relatedly similar but different positions, which is if they flee to the Union Army, they are nominally free, but not really, and most of them are placed in camps where they are expected to work. They are receiving some rations, but it is a whole, they are often not receiving enough rations, and the Army is very unwilling to fully support them. Or if they remain in place where they have been enslaved, they are often faced with food shortages. They are often faced with cuts in rations, and especially like shortages of meat. So that there's a lot of writing, even in public writings in the newspapers and things, by enslavers saying things like, well, if we use more molasses, which is very nutritious actually, although they don't really know why it's nutritious, or they don't have the same understanding of nutrition that we do. Like, we can cut the meat rations, or instead of meat rations, maybe we should try using dried fish and things like that. So there is hunger and sickness across that lower class strata. I'll also say this though, which is like, none of this is well quantified. So there are anecdotal accounts of people starving to death. But I don't.
So we don't have
number.
calorie counts.
No, they don't have. The calorie exists, but it's not really in use yet. So that their understanding of nutrition is things like there's like hot foods and cold foods, or like meat is better for you, but maybe African Americans, their particular digestive system, they don't need as much meat. Pork seems more nutritious than beef because it has more fat. So, and they certainly, they know that if you don't have certain kinds of foods, you're going to get certain kinds of diseases, right? So they know that scurvy comes. They don't know vitamin C, but they know that if you have citrus or if you have vinegar as a regular part of your diet, you won't get scurvy. Things like that. But you're sort of right at the dawn of modern nutritional science, and they're not quite there yet.
Okay, so since you mentioned African Americans, one of the ways in which the Civil War is so interesting is because it is also the scene for the collapse of the largest slave society, or the largest slave system in the history of the world. And only when I read the materials that you're working on did I realize that in the study of emancipation, which is once again a very researched, very well understood at this point historical process, food is never treated systematically. We sort of take it for granted that either African Americans received food from the Union Army or that they were just hungry. Mm-hmm. But we never actually question what did it mean to be hungry, nor do we ever question how the Union Army understood its obligation to feed African Americans. And so how did that play out? What did it mean for the federal government having to feed people? What traditions did it draw on? What resources did it use when it, for the first time, was in charge of feeding hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people?
So the federal government at this point, the United States government at this point, did not have a tradition of any kind of social welfare. That really, American social welfare systems, such as they are, come out of the Civil War, whether it's in the form of the Freedmen's Bureau, which existed from 1865 to 1868.
Which is just because this audience is not as well versed in this stuff as the ones you're usually thinking of. Basically, that's the first welfare agency. It's the first time that the federal government creates a system that is meant to deal with charges of the state in some ways, right?
That they
people who have absolutely nothing, like literally the clothes on their back.
Right, and so one of the things the Freedmen's Bureau does, especially in its first year or so of operation, as the war is ending, and then the immediate months after the war, is they distribute rations. They distribute rations also to Southern whites, destitute Southern whites, in addition to African Americans. And then later, there's like pension bureaus and things like that. But so during the war itself, as African Americans flee to the Union and come under Union control, and the Union Army gradually adopts policies that recognize that these people are free and are not to be returned to their enslavers, and that they do actually need some support, there are some regulations for how they're supposed to be fed. All pretty much based off of the base Union Army ration. And the idea is that working men would be given basically a soldier's ration, women and children would be given half rations. But a lot of that regulation, first of all, is not standardized across the Army, so it's very much dependent on where you are and which Army commander is in charge of you, how willing he is to feed this population, house this population, care for this population, give them medical care. Distinctions are often made between the wives and children of Black men who are enlisted in the Union Army versus women and children who do not have a male relative in service in some way. It's very haphazard. Also, some people are working on plantations that have been given over to the control, oftentimes, of investors, private investors, even as the war is going on. They also are supposed to follow certain guidelines for how to feed people, how much food to have on hand, because again, right, even though people can grow their own crops, there is a period of time from when you put the seeds in the ground till you can harvest that you don't have that food, right, that you have nothing to eat. So they're supposed to be feeding people, but they aren't also. And then the sort of flip side, or the other problem with this is, while the Union Army does not want to be supporting people, African Americans, it does want African Americans laboring. It wants African Americans working, growing crops. And so the things that African American families could do, having their own gardens, owning a boat if they're on a coastal area or a river where they could go out and fish, maybe having a gun for hunting, right? The Union Army does not want these African Americans to be fully self-supporting. They don't want to support them. They want them to work, but they don't want them to have their own independence. And so they're also passing, because then they won't work. Because what African Americans want is to no longer be working, growing a staple crop for somebody else.
Okay, I'm just, I'm cutting you
it's a huge
mid-sentence just to say that, again, connecting to the previous panel, when Fatina was saying the Israeli government wants to involve Gazans in the economy, but it doesn't want integration, right? So it's not the same relationship, but it's the same attempt to utilize cheap labor and control the people laboring it without allowing the laborers to enjoy the full benefits of their toil.
Exactly. And just one of the things, I don't know if you read it or not, one of the sections of a chapter I was writing has to do with this idea of food as control. And so in a plantation economy, food was used as a measure of social control, right? Here are the rations that you get. Sometimes if you had a special job, you got more rations, or you would get more, they would give you a prize for like shucking the most ears of corn or picking the most cotton. You could be rewarded with food. Having a garden of your own is a privilege. Being allowed to sell some of the proceeds of that garden. So food is elemental to the control of the plantation economy. And so what happens for African Americans is they leave the plantation in these cases, and they find themselves under control of the Union Army, which is also using food as a means of control, and consciously or unconsciously replicating so many of the ways that enslavers had used food.
Okay, that's a really key insight. So give us a little more. How did enslavers use food, and how do you see the continuity between enslavement and labor for the army when it comes to food policy?
So one of the ways that food is used is by giving rations in this controlled manner. So there was a whole literature of plantation management that said, okay, like this is roughly how much you should be feeding people. It's like a peck of corn, which is, I keep looking it up and I keep forgetting, I think it's 8 gallons is a peck.
This is also peacetime?
This was peacetime carried into war, yes.
Yeah.
So a peck is like 8 gallons of cornmeal.
This is the age of slavery.
Yeah, the age of slavery, so like 1850s. A pound and a half to 3 pounds of meat, which would be like usually kind of fatty bacon. That's your sort of floor for somebody for a week. And then supplemented with vegetables when different kinds of vegetables when they're in season, molasses, again, which partly because it's a sweetener, but also because it is actually full of vitamins, like it's super nutritious actually. But a lot of the issue was, how is that ration distributed? So, and this also has to do with large slave holdings, where you're talking about 20, 30, 40 enslaved people, as opposed to
a farm with like five people that are basically sharing in the family's nutrition.
Right, but so the question is, right, should everyone get their own rations distributed individually and they have to cook for themselves every night? Or, and again, this is in the kind of plantation management literature that I've looked at, what they say is it's much better to have a centralized cook who takes all the rations and cooks them, and then the food is distributed out in a centralized manner. And so when people come into these camps, again, the Union Army is working off of the same ration, generally, again, basing it off of the military ration, which, interestingly enough, the military ration and the enslaved ration is rough. Military ration is supposed to have a lot more components, but the amounts are not that different. It's interesting. And again, these same kinds of questions. Should people be cooking for themselves? Should it just be distributed? And so controlling in that way. Should African American families be allowed to grow crops for themselves? Should women be allowed to make an income by baking cakes and pies and selling them to the soldiers?
And the goal is always to have them eating enough, but not costing too much money.
Exactly.
Which, I mean, I really do hate to say this, but in the Israeli army controlled calorie counts in Gaza even before the current war, and right, and even more so during this war. And so, in some ways, continuities and their reverberations
Right.
speak to that too.
Right. It's always about trying to walk that line. Like I think I read in one of these plantation managers, right? You want them to be strong enough to work, but not to gain weight.
Right.
Which is right. It's sick. It's sickening.
Because when they gain weight, they're not as effective as like.
Well, it's also if they gain weight, then you're feeding them too much, and you can
and you're losing money.
And you're losing money.
Right.
What's also interesting though with these rations is that when you make the shift from it being the Union Army to the Freedmen's Bureau being in control of these rations, and rations are being also given to quote unquote destitute white families, like poor white women, white women who have lost husbands or brothers or sons or whatever, are also coming to the Union for food, particularly after the war has just ended. So I have a set of rations records from Jackson, Mississippi. And what's really interesting there is the way that Black women and white women are differently treated. And you can tell just from looking at these slips. So the white women are Mrs. So-and-so, Mrs. So-and-so, Mrs. So-and-so. The Black women are just a colored woman. And they get the same amount of like cornmeal and they get the same amount of meat, but the white women also are given beans and they're also given rye coffee and a little bit of sugar, and the Black women aren't. And I'm still like, every time I think about it, I'm still sort of flabbergasted by how just how overt and how open this was. And it's just sort of, it's just, so it's unbelievable and yet believable.
So in that way, do you now, you're pretty deep into this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you now see food as a kind of clarifying lens?
Yes.
For war?
Yes. I mean, I've always seen it as that kind of clarifying lens, that to me, when you use food, it's a way to understand. So initially, the very germ of the idea of this book came when I was working on my first book, which was my dissertation. So it's painful every time I say it out loud, but literally 30 years ago, it's the 30 years ago sounds weird to me, but literally 30 years ago when I was working on this and this idea of nationalism and food being intertwined and this literature of right, that we're so resourceful and we make all these substitutions and how does that refract? But as I came to work on the book, food it's your way into everything. It's your way into class conflict. It's your way into gender roles, and it's the way into, I mean, you can use it, it's a way to look at familial relationships, right? That one of the things I also use to try to figure out what kind of food people had on hand is I don't look at hunger in the army at all. I'm only looking at non-combatants. But the letters that soldiers would write home asking for food and what these women would be able, what people were sending out. So again, like a wealthy plantation owner, one of these women that I look at in North Carolina, she is constantly sending baskets of provisions to either relatives in the city or relatives on another farm, but also people who are enlisted. And she's sending whole hams and, jars of jelly, and she's sending a lot. So that tells me, first of all, she's got a lot because she can send it out. But then it's really kind of poignant because the woman I mentioned earlier, who I got a mouthful of nothing from, Martha Poteet, her husband is enlisted and she is also sending him things, and she talks about did you like the ginger cake I sent you? And I think to myself, wow, like how much did she have to scrimp and save to be able to bake him a ginger cake and send it to him? Things like that.
So, I mean, this is now clearly the moment to bring up gender, because it does seem that any systematic treatment of food has to place gender at the center. And certainly if you're not looking at hunger in the army, which is its own sort of kettle of fish.
Right.
Excuse the pun. So what is your focus here? Is it the mothers who can't feed their children, and what it means to be a mother who cannot provide children food, who is sort of failing at the most essential task of motherhood? Is that how they experience it, or is that only, my kind of 21st century mothering perspective?
That is how many women experience it. It is hard to find women who express it in those terms, because the women who are losing children to starvation are the women who are, of course, I'll just tell you this, right, least likely to be literate, right, African Americans, least likely to be literate, destitute, right, who are not necessarily writing, we don't necessarily have access to that. What I think of this as is it is a book about gender, and I try to frame it a bit, and I will freely admit that this is a book that has spiraled a little bit out of my control, that it has gotten bigger than I anticipated. As books do, that I anticipated it being. It has taken longer, as books also do. I mean, I'm in the fortunate position that I'm far enough along in my career that I don't need this book. I don't need this book to be promoted or anything like that. So it can take what it takes. So it is, I'm trying to think of it as a book a little bit about sustenance and sustaining, and what does it take to sustain a nation? What does it take to sustain a family? What happens when those maybe are in conflict? And also who gets sustained, right? Who gets protected, whose stories get told, and so that I also think, like, one of the last section of the book that I haven't really written yet, but have been playing a lot in my head, actually goes after the Civil War. There's a famine. They literally call it the famine of 1867 in the South, where crops fail in a few southern states. And on the one hand, you have the Freedmen's Bureau, which is ostensibly, supposedly responsible for taking care of African Americans. I haven't looked at those records yet. But you also have these northern relief associations. So it's after the war, and often through churches or wealthy families, there are these northern relief associations that raise money and use it. Either they send money south, or they send literally like barrels and barrels and barrels of flour south. So there's actually, New York actually has two
of sort of form of humanitarian aid.
It's charity,
right?
And they're
19th century terms,
total like stereotypical 19th century charity terms. They'll have a charity bazaar to raise money. But the records of one of these groups, which is the New York Ladies Southern Relief Association, it is a mouthful, are at, they were part of the Museum of the Confederacy, and now they're at the Virginia Museum for History and Culture. And it's 800 letters that were written to this organization from all across the South. And so Yael mentioned I've done some digital projects. So I have these letters all in a database. And I have worked periodically. I've had a student work with me to try to do like a little bit of like social network analysis to see, okay, who's writing, who's corresponding the most with this association. What I haven't had the time to do yet is the next level, which is a lot of these letters will say, like, they're often through ministers, will say, like, I gave Mrs. So-and-so a barrel of flour. I gave Mrs. So-and-so a barrel of flour. And I would love to really see, how those tentacles kind of work down, but also what I want to see, and I don't know, maybe it's going to have to be an article or something and not part of this book, is is the Southern Relief Association operating in the same place as the Freedmen's Bureau Association? I know that the Southern Ladies Relief Association is almost entirely feeding white women, not Black families. And so I want to see, are they sort of covering the same places? I want to play around with that a little bit. I haven't gotten as far with it as I would have liked.
Do you think that questions of food and food insecurity and the lack of access to food determined the results of the war?
So the Confederacy loses for a lot of reasons. One reason for sure is that they do really start to run out of food pretty much across the board by the last year of the war, so 1864 into 1865. And my second book, which is about Sherman's march, one of the reasons that Sherman went through central Georgia and then up through the Carolinas is because those were areas that had been relatively untouched by the war up until that part. And those are areas that had, especially the first part where he goes through Georgia in November and December, were areas that it was just after the harvest. And so his men amass, take, and also destroy a tremendous amount of food that not only could have fed civilians, but also could have been sent up to the armies. So I think it accelerates the defeat of the Confederacy, but I also think that the Confederacy lost because it just couldn't. It's in some ways a very old-fashioned argument, which is that it was not strong enough to defeat a large industrialized army, a nation with, 2.5 times their population. That the Confederacy had 8 million whites and 4 million African Americans. The Union had 20 million people, 22 million people. And so the Confederacy mobilized something in the range of about 80 to 90% of its eligible white male population. And the Union, I don't know the number.
No,
it's not that high.
No, it's 50.
It's
around
50. So the Union, the last year of the war, they just could keep throwing men in. And so that really, I think, brings about the end.
Right. I think the reason that I think of this is because the desperation that comes with being hungry.
Yes.
Is unlike any form of wartime suffering, perhaps with the exception of losing children or...
And it's so interrelated, right? Hunger and sickness is so interrelated because when you're hungry, you can't fight off disease. And so, does a child die from hunger or does a child die, right? Would the child have gotten sick if, whatever they're sick with, even just, an ague, right, from the flu or something? Would they have gotten sick if they had been better nourished?
So the reason that I'm so interested in your project, and was even before food and famine became something we think about, or at least some of us think about day in and day out, is because there's a way in which I agree with you that this is key to the collapse of social cohesion, to the absence of solidarity, to the ways in which people at some point just sort of fend for themselves,
right,
and are willing to sort of drop the larger national project that they had embarked on with great fanfare in 1860.
Yes, and you also see, in a city in Richmond or something, they talk about all these thefts. There's so much theft going on in Richmond. And of course, when hungry people don't steal food just for fun, right? People steal food because they are hungry. And so you can see that, but it does add to this sense of social disorder and this idea that the world is kind of falling apart. So yes, it does accelerate all of that, or it feeds into all of that. And particularly in the Confederate case where Civil War armies don't fight in the wintertime. And so you have this long period of time, let's call it November, December, January, February, where a lot of men desert. Technically, they're deserting. I think of them as more away without leave. Because they do come home to try to care for their families. And again, Martha Poteet, who I keep mentioning, the year before, so in either late 1863 or early 1864, she had a sick child and her husband came home for a few weeks and then he went back to the army. I mean, at this point, I think the Confederacy had long ago realized that shooting men for desertion is kind of counterproductive. And so he was imprisoned for a few months, but then put back into service. So yeah, you do see that a lot where men are coming in and out of the army because at some point they do care more about their families and trying to care for their families.
So, in a way, this is now something that I'm sort of processing as you're speaking, that the gendered experience of being desperate to feed your family and being unable to do so. I mean, men share in this too. Mm-hmm. So in some ways that is perhaps a cross-gender experience. Mm-hmm. And yet, is it the case that for women, the fact that they have a hard time growing food because raising crops requires a certain muscle mass that women may not have, and in some ways it highlights dependence, and it highlights helplessness in the face of war.
Right, you can't grow.
And so we have this image. We were talking about this yesterday in class as well. That we think of wars as being moments of empowerment for women, right? These are moments in time in which women can gain more independence and take on roles that they would not have been able to take before the war. But that is not necessarily true for the Civil War. And I actually think it may not be true for, I don't know, the current wars. If we want to, think about, we were talking about Sudan earlier. We haven't said a word about Ukraine and Russia all day, which is weird.
And we haven't talked too about displacement, right? So a lot of women don't stay on their family farms or don't stay in their homes. They either move in with relatives, they are forced to refugee. We don't really think about the Civil War as in the terms of a humanitarian crisis, but there are white refugees as well. And so there is this tremendous amount of displacement. And this is an issue too where African Americans are concerned, which is when you're displaced, right? So for African Americans, if they stay on farms and plantations, they at least have access to food that they can grow, food that they have grown, maybe foraging in the area. But if they leave, they lose that. They lose that ability for any degree of self-support. And I think you see that again for white women refugees too, who often lose that self-sufficiency, or they try to keep the farm going. And you see in letters a lot of like, ask ask so-and-so to help you, whether that's a male relative or a male neighbor. But at the end, for most women, it's hard to keep a family farm going, especially if maybe you have a couple of sons who are young teenagers, but maybe you only have small children.
Or daughters. Right. Which are, of course, part of the labor force in wartime.
But in other ways.
But in other ways. Yeah. Okay. I have other questions as well.
Okay.
But I was actually thinking that now may be a good time to open the floor for some questions from the audience, and then kind of have my final slate of questions as we near the end of our time. So the floor is open, and or I'd love to have you ask the first question, but but I do kind of, if that's allowed, give the audience a sort of an assignment. In terms of placing the Civil War in the kind of, now that we have a sense of what food insecurity looked like in the Civil War, how do we, like, I'd like to think about how we can place it along a timeline of starvation in wartime. And that's, I don't know, that's a question that I want to maybe think about and tackle last. But where, I mean, food is on the one hand a universal concern and a fundamental concern in every armed conflict, because armed conflict is so destabilizing to any society. And yet every armed conflict is different, right? And the mid-19th century, especially in the South, is a very particular moment. And so, no, it's not the same as what we've seen in Gaza. No. And it's also not the same as what we've seen in wars of the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, the wars of the ancient world. And I don't know, this is something that I'd like to kind of have process in my mind and maybe think about with the audience of how, are there fundamentals that cut across time and space when it comes to civilians suffering from food insecurity in wartime? And what does that mean? And does that help us think about maybe a universal experience of wartime, or at least of wartime suffering?
Do you want me to answer that?
Why don't you try, and then we'll throw it to the audience.
The one caution that I often make with students, or when my book about Sherman obviously engaged a lot with this idea of total war, and is Sherman the father of total war, and what does that look like? And there was a book that came out in the early 80s called Sherman's March in Vietnam by James Reston Jr., where he makes this argument that you can kind of draw a straight line from Sherman's march through World War I, World War II, and into the Vietnam War, and particularly the My Lai massacre. And that I don't agree with, and I talk about that a lot in my Sherman book, but because the idea of total war in the Civil War sense is a war that is against civilian property. And so food does fall into that, but is not a war against civilian bodies directly, which is to say that the Union Army does understand what they're doing. They do use food shortages and starvation as part of their policy, and they, in their something called the Lieber Code, which is the kind of Union rules of war, it is legitimate to do that. It is not like the war, like World War I. It is definitely not like World War II.
And it's not like Vietnam.
And it's not like Vietnam, right? There's no body count. They're not making war on civilians. This is not. I mean, I did read. There's a great book about hunger in World War II called, I think it's called The Taste of War. It's by Lizzie Collingsworth, I think, which was really interesting because she does look globally. The hunger in the Civil War is not on that same global scale, whether we're talking about Leningrad or whether we're talking about Asia, it's very, very different. So I do feel like that's an important caveat to always keep in mind. That's not to say that if you are an individual suffering, that you are thinking to yourself, wow, it's going to be a lot worse.
Yeah, like, 50 years from now, people are going to be even more miserable. So, yeah.
Right. Or I'm really glad I'm not a peasant when I'm in the 30 Years' War. But just that there is, in many ways, the Civil War, is sort of transitional. Right. It's this moving from the kind of Napoleonic Wars to later wars.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm happy if people reflect on that in their questions, but let's open the floor now for real. So, or you go first, and then Dotan, and we'll take it from there.
So, thanks very much. It's really interesting. I had two questions. First, I think you already answered, but still, regarding again, like Sherman's March to the Sea, did they think of starvation as a weapon? Did they think of starvation as a weapon? Was there a discussion of the morality of that issue? So that's one question. And the next question is, given the horrific experience of starvation, of famine, I'm a bit surprised, or maybe I'm not. I'm a bit surprised it didn't take more of a part in the Lost Cause mythology, of like the Yankees starved us, is less of the things that I usually see.
Mm-hmm. Okay, maybe just a word about the Lost Cause mythology, because again, this is not something that everyone hears.
That is a great question. So the Lost Cause mythology, because those are two interrelated. I can answer those two questions in one answer. The Lost Cause mythology is what grows up after the Civil War from the white Southern perspective, which is this argument that it was this noble cause that they were fighting, and they really don't talk about the slavery piece. This is where you'll hear the argument that it was about states' rights.
Woodrow Wilson?
Yeah, Woodrow Wilson, a proponent of it, many white Southerners, and it becomes really the dominant cultural view in the United States of the Civil War. I think it really does, Northerners kind of buy into it too. And I think if you want to think about a kind of lost cause cultural product that you might be familiar with would be the movie Gone with the Wind, is the text of a lot of that. So, in terms of Sherman's March, they are very cognizant. Sherman is very cognizant that they are using starvation and hunger as a weapon, which is why if they are living off the land, so they are directed to take all the food that they can carry, but they are not ordered to destroy food, but nobody stops anybody from destroying food. Whether that's just slaughtering hogs and leaving them or what have you. In terms of the Lost Cause, which, Sherman is a great villain of the Lost Cause, more of a villain in retrospect than he was in actuality, because Sherman actually really kind of liked white Southerners and
Sherman hated black people.
And he hated black people. So Sherman justifies his harshness famously by saying war is cruelty and you cannot refine it. And his argument is, I'm going to make war so terrible that the Confederacy will surrender. And as soon as they surrender, we can all just be friends again. In terms of the Lost Cause mythologizing of it, it becomes not so much that the Yankees tried to starve us and that's why we hate them. It's that the Yankees tried to starve us and we beat them back and we survived that starvation. So you see it in these recipes that kind of continue. Right, you see it in Gone with the Wind when she eats the radish and swears that she'll never be hungry again. And also you see it in these cookbooks and things that will reference, sometimes they'll reference a Confederate recipe, which will be like a Confederate cake would be made with corn instead of white flour, things like that.
Do they cease being hungry as a humiliation?
I think they see
that play, and what would that mean if they see it?
I don't think they see being hungry. I think maybe in the moment they see it as suffering and sacrifice, and there's all that.
But there's nothing heroic about being hungry. Dying on the battlefield is heroic. Being hungry at home, is that heroic?
It is I think they would argue it is what you are giving up for the cause. No, if you're a man, and this is where gender comes in too, right? So yeah, if you're a soldier and you die of measles or starvation but see, they don't really track it again as soldiers. I don't think are dying of starvation. They're hungry for sure, but that's not what's killing them. It's everything else.
Right. I mean, no, except for black people, they're not dying of starvation.
Yes, exactly.
They're talking about dying of starvation.
Exactly, and it's a rhetorical device more than an actual device. And again, you can't, because there's no quantification of it. That's why I actually, over the years that I've worked on this, I've started to talk about hunger rather than starvation, because I feel like that is more accurate.
Right, and that in some ways talking about starvation is falling into the trap they have laid for us.
Yeah, I have no evidence. I mean, there's scattered pieces of evidence for scattered populations.
Right, right. And then of course we're always sort of up against the, the silence of the archive when it comes to the poorest, the most destitute, the most suffering. I mean, those are the people we can't access as easily or at all the way that we can access a white plantation.
Right, although ironically, Jim Downs for his book, Sick from Freedom, which is a book about how African Americans in these Union camps were dying of everything. That is actually pretty good quantification for a population that we don't have for anybody else, really.
Right. So starvation we can perhaps locate that part of the food story in the refugee camps of the Civil War rather than in homes.
Right, because we don't know.
Okay, good. Dutan and then Snate.
Thank you. This is very, very interesting and also talks to so much of what we've been discussing. I had a kind of several thoughts. It's interesting, I mean, bringing this to Gaza specifically and also to the Middle East more broadly, it is intriguing that Netanyahu and the previous Minister of Defense, they are both accused in the crime of starvation. This is specific.
In The Hague.
Yes. Among war crimes. At the same time, and I'm not defending this approach, I'm kind of reflecting on it. There are good arguments to be made about the complexity of attaching intentionality to a phenomena as complex as famine. And when I'm thinking about it, I'm reflecting on a class that I teach on First World War, and we're just covering some literature about the famine of Mount Lebanon during the First World War. And what you see there is that every several decades, you have a different villain attached to the famine. It started with the Ottoman Empire, then it became the Allied powers. And today, the current narrative in Lebanon is that it was the profiteers and speculators that were basically making fortune out of this. And I mean, coming back to the previous question, I wanted to ask whether these phenomena exist there as well. Just a second point, very briefly, is that a colleague of ours, Alma Igra, she's a scholar of nutrition, history of nutrition, and she wrote about the calorie as a measurement. And during the Gaza war, she published an essay, came out in Hebrew and also in the LA Review of Books, under the title of Hunger Time. Or famine time, I think hunger time, and she made these 2 points. First, that famine and hunger and starvation does not fall neatly into chronologies of war, not to the battlefields, not to the kind of the ebbs and flows and up and down of what's going on in the war. It has a different sort of temporality of kind of the damages happening to the body, about the social integrity of the people, that goes far beyond when the war is ended, but also kind of changes how we can just understand what are the main processes in the war. The second point she makes is that is about humanitarianism and the idea that humanitarianism basically replaces the right to live off the land. So in a place like Gaza, if you want to understand famine in Gaza, you have to understand like 70 years of the Gaza Strip as a place that is deprived of basically its population from living off the land, and then what you have left is kind of the humanitarian basis, and then when the humanitarian basis is dropped, immediately you have famine.
Okay. There are a lot of resonances to that. So there's a lot in Southern Confederate newspapers of anti-speculation, anti-extortion. These are speculators and extortioners they are the villains, right? Particularly in the first few years of the war, because shortages start almost immediately of certain kinds of goods, but there still are always, right, they run out of salt and things like that. But again, as I think Yael mentioned or somebody mentioned earlier, right, there's always food. There's always food. There's food in commissary warehouses. There's food in stores. It's just that it's expensive because it's out of the reach of people. And so it's very interesting. What I noticed is there'll be a lot of little pieces in local newspapers saying, you know, Mr. So-and-so is selling corn to soldiers' families at such and such a price, which will be far below the market price, very low prices. So they're always calling people out by name who are selling cheap or giving away food. And then they'll also be constantly raging against speculators and extortioners, the speculators and the extortioners. They never name them. So I'm like, who's doing it? I mean, someone's doing it. And if you're all in Fayetteville, like, you gotta know who's doing it. But they're not calling it out. So it's this very kind of, they're like, the evil phantoms are the speculators and extortioners. And nobody knows who they
during
are.
slavery, the evil phantoms were the slave traders, right?
Exactly. They're the
It was
scapegoats.
never the slave owners. It was always
Right.
the traders.
Right, they're the scapegoats, right? As these nebulous speculators and extortioners, but who are they? So I think they're afraid to call them out by name, I guess. I don't know. I haven't been able to quite pull that piece, pull that thread. But yeah, it's definitely all in there. And then your second piece, which was about sorry, it's gone.
The chronology.
The chronology is, yes, I think the chronology is different because it isn't tied to what's happening directly on the battlefield, except in the case that it gets progressively worse for the Confederacy as the Union gains more and more territory. And particularly in 1863, the Union gains full control of the Mississippi River, which you probably all don't have the map of the United States memorized in your heads the way I do, but basically cuts about a third of the Confederacy off from the rest of the Confederacy. And that area includes Texas, which is a big beef and wheat growing area. And so those are resources that can no longer be utilized by the Confederacy. So it does go that way, that chronology. But the long-term effects, and again, I don't know that someone, like now we know that it has, you know, if you undergo famine as a child, right, your metabolism is permanently changed. And even they talk about the epigenetics now, that even your children can have different metabolism. I don't know that that has really been studied or traced yet for the Civil War question.
Yeah, and okay, maybe we'll have a little bit of time for the post-war era, the long post-war era, but there are a bunch of questions and I want to get to them. Snaid, and then Chazi, and then Dror. Okay. So maybe we'll take a couple now together, yeah? Let's do Chazi and Dror, and then...
Oh, I see.
Okay, let me write this down for us, because we won't remember it by the time. Yes?
Whether cases of like manipulation of collective memory about the hunger, because the images of hunger are very strong and they can really create the image of a villain, of someone who forces this hunger. For example, in the Netherlands, they had the winter hunger, the hunger winter, which of course affected only the northern part, but it became a foundational list of post-war Netherlands. It's remembered now as if it were affecting the entire country, thereby presenting the Germans as villains. Sorry? But it was only part of the country.
Write down
So
collective memory and then
put
just put Sherman as a dash and I'll remember.
Thank you so much. This is really thought-provoking. You mentioned briefly Women's Southern Relief Association. And I was thinking about the British Save the Children Fund, which started off as a form of protest against the Allied blockade on Germany after World War I. And sort of informed me the belief that women could moralize war and moralize foreign policy, etc. So in the context of the American Civil War, I was wondering first when these charity groups started springing up, was it during the war or after? And secondly, how would you frame the narrative? Was it a form of protest? Did they think themselves as filling the motherly role of feeding others? Was it a form of post-war reconciliation, or was it something else?
Okay, so we're starting with difference between urban destruction and rural destruction. You wanted me to answer that?
Yeah, because I'm looking at you because I don't think there is much of a difference between urban destruction and rural destruction in the Civil War, because first of all, there are not so many urban areas, that they're not so big.
So you're thinking World War II Europe, whereas in the American South, 90% of the population lives in the countryside. Yeah. So
I don't think they're.
I feel like the destruction in urban areas serves as a symbol, right? It's meant to.
Yeah, Sherman.
Whereas the destruction in the countryside is meant to destroy resources, right? So I think that's what you're trying to get at, Sneed. Am I getting you?
Like, Sherman destroys Atlanta. He burns Atlanta, but first he empties it of civilians. So that's actually what he says war is cruelty and you cannot refine it, is when there's this exchange of letters between him and the mayor of Atlanta, and the mayor says, like, I can't believe you're kicking all the civilians out of Atlanta. And that Sherman's like, yeah, but I am. But that's because he just doesn't want to have to leave troops behind to hold the city. So he sends all the civilians out. Then they're supposed to be, quote, burning everything of military value. The problem is, in the 19th century, you can't really control that, right? So you start the fire in the armory, but then the fire leaps, and it also burns domestic, non-military buildings. And then the same thing happens later on Sherman's march in Columbia, when the city of Columbia burns. And that's a subject of great debate, because Sherman says, I didn't burn it. Wade Hampton, the retreating Confederates, burned it, because when the Confederates retreated, they set the cotton in the city on fire so the Union couldn't get it. And they all say, no, Sherman burned Columbia. So there is a little bit of that, but it's not the same. It's more, I think, incidental than
right. No, I think in that way, the Civil War, like you were just saying, is a transitional moment when some policies that would become standardized in the 20th century are still fundamentally unnatural, right?
Right.
For these people, growing up and evolving in this culture.
And even Sherman's march, where this gets to the collective memory question, Sherman becomes a big villain for starvation and for destruction, and he's the one who's sort of blamed for lots of this. But even Sherman did not really burn houses. They burned barns. Yeah, they burned barns, they burned smokehouses, they burned cotton gin houses, but they weren't, occasionally, yes, sometimes they did target civilian homes, but mostly it was not targeted against civilians. And in the greater collective memory, he becomes a great villain, even though he's not even the first one in the Union Army to be using these policies. So he takes on a lot of that kind of collective guilt. And then the third question, the women's relief associations, I think these grow out of 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. You have a lot of women's abolitionism associations, and also in the North, and also like women's associations, maybe raising money for a school or an institution, or actually one of the biggest money-raising organizations in the 1850s is called the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, where they raise money to preserve George Washington's home, Mount Vernon. And I think that's the impulse that's driving these women after the war, along with a reconciliationist impulse. It's not, I don't see them operating in any kind of protest capacity. And I'm pretty sure that the woman who runs the particular organization that I'm looking at has some familial ties to the South. And a lot of these Northern women have some kind of family ties to the South. And so I think they see it as a way to kind of bring the Union back together.
Right, which is one of the differences between a civil war and a war between nations.
Right.
That at the end of the day, the goal is to bring the rebels home, right? And that creates a lot of the challenges of the post-war era and generates the horrific price that African Americans pay
Right.
for the aftermath.
Because the way families mend fences often, right, is you sort of sweep a lot of stuff under the rug and just try to not talk about it and make nice, which is what
Right. And redraw
happens.
the boundaries of
Right.
who's in and who's out.
right.
Maybe.
I have not come across any instances of that kind of cannibalism or survival cannibalism in the Civil War. And that's not to say it wasn't unknown in the 19th century South, because you have the Donner Party, which is this group of people trying to cross into California in 1848, I think, is the Donner Party. And there were some like whale ship cases. So that's part of this sense I have that it doesn't get quite that bad. But it's an interesting question. I've never seen
Right.
it.
Which kind of, comes back to this sort of notion that starvation was a figure of speech rather than a reality. And then the question becomes, what does this figure of speech mean in the context of the Civil War? And while we're on this topic, I feel like a sort of a running thread in this conference, which we haven't quite addressed directly, and I'm sorry that most of this is in Hebrew.
No, I wish I could have.
Right.
Yeah, my
no.
Hebrew is not good.
Right. It could have been, but it's not.
Had I paid more attention in Hebrew school.
Right. You write the history of perpetrators to some degree, because you write the history of the white South.
I mean, yes, not in this book.
Not just the white South, but you've spent a great deal of time and energy studying the white South in its moment of crisis. And I think a lot of the work that has been introduced today was the study of perpetrators. And I wonder, as you get so close and personal, especially with white slaveholders in this book, in the context of seeing them at the moment in which they're running out of food, even if they're not having to resort to cannibalism or they're not starving the way the Dutch starved in World War II. How does looking at these people through the prism of food change how you see them as a historian? Where does kind of empathy creep into this?
Yeah.
Does it? Should it?
I mean, I've always, in some ways, this book is connected back to my first book, which again, I started working on in the mid-90s as a graduate student. And I think I've always been empathetic to white Southerners in the sense that they were in a system that they had created and a system that they could have gotten out of, but they were still, most of them, you're a human being and you're kind of doing the best you can day by day. That's not to say that I don't sympathize, right?
But they're a product of the system in the same way that we're all products of systems.
I do think that 30 years of also watching the scholarship change and watching the public United States understanding of the Confederacy and what that meant, and watching the literal monuments to the lost cause finally crumbling.
Though they're
finally
coming back.
They are coming back. I mean, not many.
Not many. And hopefully that too is temporary, in the same way that everything is temporary now.
But watching that happen has made me, I think I said to Yael the other day, like, I'm kind of tired of white Southerners. I'm sort of exasperated with them. But I'm also, frankly, exasperated and frustrated with the Union high command and the Union army and the Union soldiers who, when faced with hungry people, are unwilling to simply feed them and are so worried that they would, by feeding this population of people who have worked their entire lives, by making sure that the enslaved, by giving them enough to live on for a few years, that they're going to create this permanent dependent class that you just kind of want to shake them and scream at them.
So in some ways, looking at food has made you erase some kind of distinction that you may have had between white Northerners and white Southerners?
Yes, because I don't understand how anyone can look at hungry people and not want to feed them regardless of
especially when they're supporting your army with their labor and sustaining the war effort.
Right. Yes, especially in that case. But even if they aren't, even if you just are, that even if this is a black family who don't have a male serving in the army, how can you just let these women and children starve? Or how do you, it's just...
Because you're worried that you will create dependence.
You're worried that you'll create dependence.
Or you don't care because you don't see them as fully human.
That would be the part, that would be the as they say now, right? Like the quiet part out loud, except they kind of, I mean, that's the frustration of all of it. And some of this research I was doing, this language of dependence was research that I was doing in the spring of 2021, because I was on a fellowship when literally the United States Congress was debating. They had been giving people $300 a month for COVID, and they were debating whether they should cut it off or not, because again, people aren't going back to work. I'm like, $300, I'm sorry, is not keeping people out of the labor force. Like, no one is getting rich and sponging off the government for $300. But those parallels were very apparent to me, let's say.
Right. Well, they're apparent vis-a-vis the American welfare system more generally, I think. Oh, fine.
Thank you very much. It's just some thought that came to me. I don't know anything about it or much about it. Sorry, I don't know much about it or anything about it, but you mentioned something about the change of the Civil War and then the end of the war. And then what I understood that in that area, people were growing food, basically. And basically other, like in our era, most people, and of course in Gaza, people were not allowed, people weren't growing food because they weren't allowed. But basically, generally in our world, mostly, you're not growing your food. Like somebody is having access to it, and I would like to connect it with the issue of access that came before, and you mentioned again. So basically, I don't know if it's a question or just a thought, but do you think that in the contemporary world or in later wars, and including this war in Gaza, which is, of course, each war is different. What is the issue of access? I mean, like when you say, I don't understand how people can see people hungry and don't feed them, and then you talk about, so just, I don't know, question for I don't have a question there, but.
No, I mean, go ahead, Anne.
I'm not sure exactly how to answer that. I mean, access in like this, they did have, wait, sorry. No, I complete jet lag maybe, but so you're saying that was there access to food in the South that people were?
No, I'm saying in wars.
In wars, yes.
How can somebody decide not to give food to somebody or to make people starve? I mean, what can make people?
I mean, I think the
no, and that's back to the kind of the I hate to use the term transhistorical. It's a bad term, but I think we are asking a question here about the nature of warfare and the nature of being the stronger party.
And that it's
in an armed conflict.
You know, they talk about it in the Lieber Code in this, because I reread it on the plane. But the Union, I mean, they draw on sort of ancient laws of war, right? They're like, they'll go back to Rome and say, oh, well, you can starve civilians if it's going to hasten the end of the war. And so that's sort of the justification, right? Is that it's a pressure point to bring about the end of war. But
that
they sort of
is what we saw here over the last couple of years.
You know, that's the idea, is that because maybe some way they also think that the way the pressure works is, even if the civilians, you know, if you're the other party, right, and your civilians are starving and you know you can stop that starvation by ending the war, why won't you? Which I guess you saw a lot now.
Yeah.
But I think it is in the nature of warfare. I think the cruelty of warfare is what it forces people to do to each other.
Right. And food is so essential, right? So
I mean, you literally,
basic,
yeah.
that it is a soft spot, in some ways almost the ultimate soft spot.
If you if you let your population starve and die, what are you even fighting for?
Abigail.
Thank you, it was fascinating. I have a question about if we assume that it was mostly a way of a manner of speaking that they I mean, especially the white women, for instance, they wrote about it, but they were not really that hungry.
Right.
So I was wondering if we think about that hunger affects different women differently, in the sense that their reproductive, for instance, stops. So I was wondering whether it was part of the conversation that women talked about it, or maybe they said something about the fact that they doing it on purpose to inflict less productivity for women or something like that. For instance, I was researching hunger in the siege of Leningrad, which is an extreme case of starvation. But the question of women's body, it was present there. So I was wondering whether it was part of the conversation in some way, even though it's a completely different case, much more severe.
Okay. Hang on, before you answer, any last, Fatina, I saw another finger over there. Yes, so let's take Fatina and then the lady right behind you. And then, yeah.
Yes, a quick question, sorry. Is there any connection between ownership, the right who can access food is connected to the ownership and the property of lands over there, and this is why they treated the black body different from the white body?
Okay. And finally?
Just a comment, looking at hunger from a different perspective. Yael, you said before there is nothing heroic about hunger. Well, it depends. I can think about instances in which hunger is heroic, like in hunger strike, or when people inflict hunger upon themselves as part of a religious practice. And it can go as far as starvation.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you.
And then, of course, the question is who inflicts the hunger? Who is the control
Well,
the hunger?
starvation.
Yeah.
So you can, it really depends on the conflict. So not that hunger is hunger. Physical pain is physical pain. No, again, with pain, I can inflict pain on myself.
Right.
And
it becomes, right.
And throughout, that's such a great point. And throughout the Confederacy, really throughout the Civil War, both sides would do these. They would have these periodic days
Fasts.
they would call them days of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, where they would literally declare a national fast day where everyone was supposed to go to church, and they'd hear these preachers talking about, right, how they have to humble themselves so that God will be on their side again and all of that. So that's really interesting. In terms of the two body questions, I do think that, so the piece about reproduction, I again have not seen anything about that. I mean, I think what's probably most disruptive to reproduction rates during this period is the fact that men are away, rather than,
Or maybe they don't know.
or they may.
Hungry hurts your reproductive.
Yeah, I just don't know enough about kind of the state of reproductive knowledge at that time. But I know that I haven't seen people, in my own research, I haven't come across it, people talking about it or writing about it. I think if anything, their concern is more if they're nursing mothers. That as nursing mothers, if their milk dries up or something like that, would be their greatest concern if they couldn't literally feed their children from their own bodies. In terms of treating Black bodies and white bodies differently, I don't think they would think of, at the time, would have thought of it in those terms, but it's just such a clear racialization of Black women are just not gonna, they shouldn't be entitled to as much as white women. And again, even just the use of these honorifics that these white women, even though like their husbands might have been fighting for the Confederacy as white married women or white widows, they're still entitled to more of an identity than these newly freed Black women.
I mean, Black women in the South would not be entitled to be referred to as Mrs. until the 1960s.
Right.
So, yeah, so there's a way to go there.
Certainly not by whites. I mean, within their own community,
right.
of course, yes.
Clearly.
But
Okay, thank you so much.
my pleasure. This was great.
Thank you.